Sanaz Sohrabi, born in Tehran, received her MFA from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and her BFA from the University of Tehran. She's currently pursuing a practice-based PhD at the Center for Interdisciplinary Studies in Society and Culture at Concordia University. Sohrabi's work has been screened and exhibited internationally at the 50th International Film Festival in Rotterdam, Indie Lisboa in Portugal, where she won the Best Short Film Award, FIC Valdivia in Chile, where she won the Special Jury Mention, Montreal International Documentary Festival, Sheffield Docfest in the UK, and Kunstmuseum Bonn's Video Now 16 in Germany. Sohrabi has been awarded numerous fellowships and residencies, such as Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture, American University of Beirut, and SOMA Summer School Ciudad de Mexico, Es Nodas Résidence d'Artiste, and Vermont Studio Center. Welcome, Sanaz.
Thank you so much.
That's a big shot.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, and for everyone to make the effort to come here on Saturday afternoon. Thank you to Roxanne, to Prakash, to everyone here, Fanny, all my friends and colleagues that have been such good company and such good comrades in the past 4 or 5 years that I've been in Montreal. It's been a third home for me after Tehran, Chicago. I would like to talk a little bit about exhibition and sort of the research behind it. The exhibition is really a form of a documentary-based, very research-based installation that stems from my doctoral research at Concordia University. I've been working on the visual regimes of extraction in Iran, particularly through the prism of British Petroleum archives. British Petroleum, as the company we know it today, was established in Iran as a form of economic monopoly in 1908. It was only later in 1954 that was officially renamed to British Petroleum. And in my work, I've been really fascinated by this, the entanglement between extractive industries and film and photography as themselves embodied technologies of extraction of images, of a form of archival regime upon which a system of representation is predicated, through which meanings and knowledges are formed and shaped and circulated. So for me, when I was working with the BP archives at the beginning, I was really sort of inundated with these images, and I really didn't know how can I sort of like hook the narrative that I wanted, and how can I sort of like tame this large body of photographs and films that I was sort of like faced with. And as someone who is like trained in photography, obviously I'm really attuned to political structure of images and how like more than being about a representation is more about the structure of feeling. It's about the structure behind the images. So it took me a while to really understand my relationship vis-a-vis these archives, which you see a tiny fraction of it. And so the starting point for me became about how can we think about the archives themselves as a form of technology of extraction? How can we think about these images as a ways in which they're not really representing, but they're symptomatic of that imperial condition of material extraction, of commodification of oil and petroleum, and really setting the imagination for how a petroleum-fueled future will look like. Some of which you see here, this reliance on formation of social spaces of leisure, this the coupling between the social spaces of leisure and production spaces of labor that was so tailored and curated within the oil towns in Iran and elsewhere as well. And it's not really unique to oil production. A lot of them, different imperial companies such as United Food Company, for instance, they also had their different oil towns, steel production, and in US they had oil company towns. So it's not like a phenomenon unique to Iran at all, but rather it was a product of late 20th century industrial development of these sort of like companies around oil, steel, you name it, agricultural products. So I started with the BP archives. That has been my main focus in my one of my main focuses in my PhD research. And one of the main focuses was to think about the coupling of leisure and labor. And as you can see here in the right side in the left side of the gallery, I really focused on thinking about cinema spaces because the company was so keen on creating these cinema spaces as a social space. They were also highly segregated. They were ranked based on ethnicity, or they ranked within the company. The social clubs were also ranked for different statuses within the company and different sort of ethnicities from the company, whether they were for European workers, the Iranian workers, or Indian workers, which was a huge migrant worker population in Iran, Palestinians, Armenians. There were a lot of different workers in the oil towns, and I was really fascinated by that. What does that proximity between labor and leisure create? Because on the one hand, when you have these focused oil towns that the workers are housed in these social housings that are so constructed and engineered that every worker who has a specific ethnicity is housed within this neighborhood. On the one hand, it creates segregation, but also on the other hand, creates a form of solidarity between them, so they can do labor organization and do different forms of. It creates another form of sort of like social grouping among them. So it creates some possibilities for mobilization. So that proximity of leisure labor became one of the main units through which I started to look at the oil towns. And particularly here you can see I focused on creating these collages that would sort of combine different images that I found that they really stuck out to me, that I felt they really had this mirroring effect. And mind that when I went through dozens of our albums and thousands of photographs, and when you go through these photographs, they kind of like start to haunt you later on. They become really, they have like a spectral quality to them that sometimes they flash in and out of your memory after a while that you've been working with them. So in a way, I think the ways in which the collage worked was, again, it speaks to that sort of like flash-like quality of that these images had on me as I was doing my research over the past 4 or 5 years. And there are some details that I think is worthy of mentioning, for instance, in the installation. For instance, when I was doing the research, I came across this magazine cover, NAFT magazine. The oil company had many publications, some in Farsi, some in English. And this magazine cover was published in September 1945, soon after the end of the Second World War. And you see the V of the victory was engraved on the main offices in Masjid Soleiman in Iran, where the first oil well was sort of like excavated, if you will, and later on became an inactive oil well. It became a cultural site, it became a museum. But to me, that was a very violent, the V wasn't a victory, but it was for violence. And to me, like when I was looking at the archive, also I saw these cartographical triptychs and diptychs of landscapes that they were doing geological surveys. And really, like again, speaking of those like flash-like quality of these images, like I saw them like as another diptych. The magazine cover that frames the mountains, and this diptych geological survey that was sort of like mapping the landscape in order to find possibilities for oil and like oil and gas, and to see if it's if there's any reserves underneath. And again, another magazine that I found that again it speaks to that sort of like imperial sort of mentality towards resources, and sort of like toward Western Asia, and how sort of like the map was sort of like depicted as this like unified sort of like one space that who owns the oil in the Middle East. And and so this was the starting point for the project, and the continuation of it. I see it as another chapter to the project that I've been doing, is really thinking about like what is a continuation of this image economy, because the inheritance of this imperial sort of like reliance on resource extraction in different societies that are, let's say, if you will, we call them post-colonial societies or post-nationalized societies, is that that inheritance is both with the continuity and rupture, the continuity of the same infrastructures, the continuities of the same imperial logic of relying on these resources. So I was really interested to see how that was translated again through the visual culture around resource extraction, around nationalization of oil, and through the prism of OPEC has been one of my main frameworks, because I'm really fascinated by OPEC as not only as an economic organization or economic cult, which is usually referred to in sort of like North American, West European context, but rather as a cultural organization with all its failures and promises. And I've been doing this research for sort of like parallel to the work on BP Archive. In a way, it has also helped me because it helps me to mirror sort of like these two timelines, if you will, that I've been thinking about. And I constructed the exhibition also in a way as two timelines, in a way, the sort of like an imperial timeline and sort of like a post-nationalized timeline, to really try to map, to try to find overlaps, to try to find contradictions within that South-to-South relationship of OPEC member states. And one of those main is the relationship between Iran and Iraq. And as two founding members of OPEC that held their first meeting in Baghdad in 1960. And to me, as I've been researching for this project, my proposition has been that the OPEC project sort of ended by the start of Iran-Iraq war, and that was sort of like the culmination of an era that was so riddled with the promises of decolonization, with the promises of like anti-colonial mobility and independence. And to me, it was really interesting to really think about not the floweriness of this like OPEC project, but rather through its through the elements that they were very contradictory, through two founding OPEC members that they go on to one of the most collateral wars of the past century, 20th century, and really think about those elements that they don't necessarily fit within the utopic project of OPEC and the project of tricontinental solidarity. And again, there's a lot of archival elements in both our timelines, but in particular on the left side of the right side of the gallery, I really tried to pull so many different archives into the timeline. I've been collecting these personally over the past 5 years, and I was an avid stamp collector as a kid, so it was really cool to go back to that habit. There are really interesting mobile sort of visual surrogates, if you will, for transplanting different ideologies, for different meanings. They were really heavily used between the 50s and the 70s as political sort of visual machines to transplant different political messages. And the philatelic visual culture around extraction is incredibly fascinating. And these are only tiny fraction of a whole larger body of stamps that I've been collecting, as well as magazines. And one detail I wanted to mention that some of you have asked during the exhibition before going on my rant. When I talk about oil, I tend to talk very copiously. So on the beginning of the exhibition space, the only moving image piece in the show is a Super 8 that I took from my computer screen. From British Pathé's media archive of a newsreel that was published in Iraq in November of 1980. The person you see is Mohammad Javad Tonguyan. He was Iran's oil minister for only 40 days, a very short period of time. He was sworn in as the oil minister in September of 1980. He was a very young, promising oil minister, and he was captured by Iraqi army on the onset of Iran-Iraq War, which started on September 22nd, 1980, as he was patrolling the oil refinery and the pipelines. And this film was this hostage video was published on Iraqi TV, and it's the last known live him as being alive. To me, that this video has been so haunting for multiple reasons, and I wanted to purchase the copyright of it from British Pathé, but it would have cost me like $1,500 or something for a 5-year universal right, and it's heavily monetized, British Pathé and a lot of different media companies. So for me, like taking a Super 8 recapture of the film really spoke to that another way to mediate these archival temporalities, but also gave me the opportunity to, for instance, extend his gaze, whether he's refusing to look at the camera or whether he's engaging with the camera. This event happened in November of 1980, and 3 weeks later, it was an OPEC meeting in Indonesia, Bali, and Iran's delegate took a large photo of him to the meeting as a protest and sat it on an empty chair. And this idea of a traveling image of the oil minister on a national TV in Iraq and in Indonesia really spoke to that migratory culture of these images at large. And especially because these media events were so important for oil industry. As you see on the right side of the TV is another series of images that you see. One is 3 film stills. That is Hassan al-Bakr, who also gave. It was an Iraqi minister who publicized Iraqi's nationalization of oil industry on a national TV via public speech in 1972. And a year later, in 1973, when Iraq was celebrating its nationalization of oil industry, they published a series of stamps, as you can see, with the motto of Arab oils for Arab, which was a very sort of like used motto among many Arab countries as a form of like showing this sovereignty over the natural resources. And on the top of the stamp, one of the film stills from that public speech on TV was reproduced. And what I did, I sort of like altered that stamp and put Iran's oil minister on the stamp as a form of like bringing back this image from the future and transplanting it into this sort of like this stamp. You know, I think the exhibition needs a lot of context, as you see, but I was hoping that the images really show their affinities when they are put in one space, and they really act as portals in and out of each other. And and I was really hoping that they would really have that spectral quality once they're sort of like sequenced as such for the viewer, that despite, you know, the condition that I couldn't provide them, let's say, the particular text or context, they would create a form of a space that would leave the viewer with a sense of what the work is about, even if it may leave some questions and unresolved observations. Yeah, so with that, I think I should stop talking. Yes.
That was great. Thank you so much, Sanaz.
Wow.
Yeah.
Anyone needs espresso shots?
A lot of context. Really brilliant. And still like, I think my mind is still engaged with all the things that you said.
Yeah.
I'm sure people in the audience feel similarly. But we will open it now to the floor if people have questions.
Yes.
I want to know about is it a vinyl?
Yes. Rhymes and Songs for OPEC was a vinyl that was produced in September 1980 in Caracas. It had a catalog and 2 vinyls. I've digitized the vinyl. I'm working on it as part of my next film. It's one of the main sort of like elements in my film. And you see some of the catalog scans in the black and white spreads, this one and that one. The catalog was bilingual, was in English and in Spanish. And there were 12 songs as part of the catalog that were sung by all Venezuelan chorus. And they were 12 songs that they would represent 12 member states of OPEC. And the songs were selected via consulting the different diplomatic missions of the OPEC member states in Caracas. And what is really fascinating is that the Venezuelan chorus sang all the songs themselves, even if it was in Arabic or Farsi or Indonesian. And it was a thing that I recently realized. That it was very common for during that period. That it was a gesture for tricontinental solidarity. That for them to really appropriate the language of other sort of like, let's say, global South countries who were part of that sort of like axis of solidarity at the time. So it was not very unlikely of that sort of like approach toward cultural appropriation as a means of solidarity, if you will. So yes, it was produced in Venezuela. It's a vinyl, and I've been working on it for the past 2 years.
And are they appropriating the dress too, or is it like
So
more, because there's something going on with the dress also?
Yeah, the dress are quite incredible. I've yeah, so it's very cultish for sure. I mean, and this is a very unique, I would say, production. In a way, it's a document of its time and place. It was published in September of 1980. It was conceived in the summer of 1980, but it's a document of its time. But also, I think it's a monument to an end of era. I would say. Because this vinyl was produced like 2 weeks before the Iran-Iraq war started, right? So in a way, that eerie coincidence of the production of this very unique production of OPEC and the start of Iran-Iraq war, I think it was very. It was a very important marker, a temporal marker for me and for the project. So, yeah, and the dresses. I don't know what exactly was sort of like, but I think it again, it's a product of its time. It didn't really surprise me.
Because it's really interesting, because there's this idea of community between the oil cities and like this thing of the vinyl. And also it's like it's like the 70s vibe where everything's peaceful and we're all happy together, and there's a sense of community, but around oil, which is now so linked to wars in the Middle East. So this is really dissonant for me, but really interesting also.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, oil was like really like, it's very pragmatic and very melancholic. It's always been sort of like tasked with doing something besides being just a material commodity. So that is sort of like evident, because you come to the exhibition, you barely see anything that would talk about that first degree of indexicality. You don't see pipelines, you don't see oil derricks, you don't see tankers, you see none of that. But this is all about oil. So again, it speaks to that, like, that you see nothing about what we may know about, sort of like what we may think what oil look like, or anything that revolves around extraction of oil would look like. But none of that, it defies expectation or our visual sort of like literacy of economies, like visual economy of oil. And yeah, and that was very intentional. That was very intentional.
Thank you.
I have like maybe 2 comments.
Yes, please.
One is, this summer I read Nomadland by Jessica Bruder, and it might interest you just because she talks about this conflation of work and leisure, and she's very nostalgic for these kind of planned company communities and the kind of protection and benefits that they afforded workers as compared to a company like, say, Amazon or Uber, which offers no protection or no benefits for their employees. So it might be interesting for you as part of your research.
Thank you.
But the other, I'm really fascinated by this metaphor of image of extraction and as kind of a parallel to resource extraction. And I guess just to clarify for myself, like, if you think about oil, it's about exploitation. it's about power. It's about creating like literal power, like power in cars, but also it's about monetary power and political power. But I'm wondering, like, if these images are like a kind of gasoline, like if they're like oil, like what are they powering? Like, is their power kind of like operating as propaganda in a way? Would that be fair to say that? Or?
I think these images have had many lives, and I think I think the company used like, I'm just talking about these images for now as, let's say, the sort of like their imperial function, the ways in which they were used for publicity purposes in different magazines of the company, and they were used for, you know, harnessing investments, and also like for in harvesting investment in Europe, but also in a way for giving the idea that like it's a fair trade, or it's a fair sort of like equation that like, oh, you're not like, you're getting modernization, you're getting a form of like social amenities, you're getting you're getting access to health, to systems of health or education and whatnot. So in a way, images worked as in a way to create a utopia around petroleum, around oil, but that has drastically changed. Like even now, when you look at like the ways in which extraction works in Canada, or extraction works in the U.S., like in North Dakota, you don't see oil, like company towns anymore. There are no oil. Everything is so makeshift. Like the whole point is that like you make quick profit and you leave, or you make quick profit with, you don't want actually visibility because of like the whole disastrous sort of like disastrous sort of like infrastructures that are in place. So actually you don't want any form of like visibility attached to the extraction, right? It's kind of like the utopia is not in the frame anymore. The utopia is like completely abstract, and it's like in the capital, like it's not in the image anymore, right? So like in a way that has completely shifted, and that has been also really interesting for me to really compare like how has that reliance on photography has changed completely. You don't want to have a camera following the oil company where they are doing sort of like extraction and drilling and fracking. So I think the oil companies don't want, I think at the moment, to have any form of they don't want that coupling anymore. The more abstract the better, the more offshore the better, right? And that also creates a form of experience, right? Like for instance, like in a place like Khuzestan, the refinery is so embedded, it's so visible, like it's not offshore, it's inland. So the form of experience it creates, not only visually, but also what you smell, what you hear. It's very different from, let's say, like somewhere like Norway, that like everything is like offshore. I had this conversation with someone from Norway, and we talked a lot about this like abstraction of extraction through offshore drilling, vis-a-vis what happens inland, and how does that create a very drastic difference of like different forms of experience and relationship toward that extraction and extractive economy. So to go back to your question, I think the image economy around oil and around extraction is a shapeshifter. It's completely changing its what we see and how we are supposed to experience that industry and that economy. Here, the utopia was in the image, but now I think it's elsewhere, and they don't want an image of oil compared to how much they were reliant on it as one of the main tools of publicity.
That's really great. Thank you.
Yeah.
I love the stamps. Right on. I was just thinking about like what you mentioned for OPEC, in terms of like this idea of like decolonization and, you know, institutions that were trying to like reimagine worlds, you know, and I love the mentions you were putting forward about like sort of a potential another world that was expressed through like OPEC, or I'm also thinking about the non-aligned movement at that time. And just, I feel like the urgency in like visiting these types of archives, just in the sense that like those imaginations seem to be sort of waning, you know, and so I'm just wondering, yeah, like how, like, was there a sense of urgency around like trying to point to that energy around, you know, a whole nother sort of paradigm of possibility, social, economic?
Actually, so speaking of non-aligned movement, so Iran was only joined non-aligned movement after the revolution. So Iran joined like in 1979, and it held its first participation. I think it was in the meeting in I think it was in Havana, if I'm not mistaken. The meeting was supposed to be in Baghdad actually, but the war had already started, Iran-Iraq war. So Iran joined the non-aligned movement really late because Iran was part of the Baghdad Pact, which was technically a completely pro-US Western European sort of political pact. And in a way, that has been a really interesting and very important line in my work, that what were the possibilities and missed opportunities because Iran politically was so repressed through its sort of like alignments with the US, being a US protector state. The nationalization didn't really go well. It basically was handed to another consortium of other European and North American oil companies. So, but Iraq, for instance, had a very successful nationalization, for instance. It went quite great for Iraq. And they had a very different process also for nationalization. So in a way, thinking about OPEC also as a part of that global decolonization that non-aligned movement was a part of, and not only as an economic cult, right? So that has been a really important sort of like note for the project, that like think about OPEC as a cultural project. Think about it as a not only about men in suits sitting around a table, but rather, they had cultural production. They had to speak to the public. The public was really important for them because, oil was so personified as a national marker, right? But at the same time was supposed to unify all the nations above it, right? So how can you have this material commodity that at the same time is so uniquely national, but at the same time is transnational through OPEC? So, and that gives rise to these competing national projects, right? And another one of these political projects, for instance, Arab League, that I have one of the stamps, and the empty meeting rooms is one of the Arab League meetings. It's either before a meeting or after a meeting. So, and I was really fascinated by this. I was like, what if I put an image of one of these Arab League meetings that has none of the people in it? It's just the empty room, similar to the empty cinema space, for instance. So I really was looking about also how they would like mirror each other in this way. And, position of Iran, for instance, like next to Arab League was very contentious, or for instance, in the first Arab Petroleum Congress, Iran and Venezuela were invited as two observing members. And interesting enough, in the opening of the Congress, which was this huge exposition around oil, there is this map that you can see in that little Super 8 frame that Iran is like kind of like abstractly included, like it's like very like distorted, but it's like tagged along. And I found it really fascinating that this map was like indicative of this ambivalence around the position of Iran with the Arab League, its inclusion, its exclusion, and its sort of like uncertainty around it. I found it interesting. And I look myself as a sort of like a visual forensic. I look for these elements that they speak to the ambivalence, they speak to the contradiction, they speak to this like traveling images, migratory images. So I've been really trying to find those ambivalences within those projects through their visual sort of culture and what has sort of like remained in stamps, magazines, and different archives and newsreels. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Sanaz. That was great.
Thank you so much.
I have so many questions still, but I think we can talk later. But yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.